Hello, my name is Courtney McFadden and I'm doing a critical analysis on the film Selma. The movie Selma is directed by Ava DuVernay and written by Paul Webb. Ava DuVernay is the first African-American female director to receive a Golden Globe nomination. Her film was nominated for a Best Picture Oscar. She received another Oscar nomination for the 13th documentary in 2016. The Academy Award-nominated film, Selma, is a beautiful tribute to Martin Luther King Jr. and his efforts to establish equality and justice for all Americans. Selma is his story and the story of so many others who risked their lives in the fight for equality. Selma was released in December 24, 2014. The film is well-produced and well-acted. The purpose for Selma is voting rights for African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 legally segregated the South. Discrimination was still rampant in certain areas. It was very difficult for blacks to vote. In 1965, Alabama became the battleground in the fight for suffrage. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson believed Southern states needed time to get used to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It is a comprehensive ban on segregation. Martin Luther King Jr. believed a second bill was necessary to secure voting rights for African Americans. The importance of this film was to highlight important and main themes and sub-themes. One main theme highlighted event in Selma was of March 7, 1965, known as Bloody Sunday. This event is when Alabama state troops and local police attacked peaceful marchers. The faces of the marchers during this time was devastating. Marchers were attacked with tear gas. Deputies were using electric cattle pods. They were chasing fleeing men, women, and children all the way back to the Brown's Chapel. Director Ava DuVernay brings the civil rights movement up to present day at a time when we need to be reminded of Martin Luther King's brave position on equality. The film brings together white and black to illustrate an important point that isn't reiterated enough. Everyone must fight for equality. It took place in Selma, Alabama, a southern state with deeply entrenched racist policies in March of 1665. In an effort to register black voters in the South, protesters marched the 54-mile route from Selma to the state capitol, where they were confronted with deadly violence from local authorities and white people who were symmetrically prevented from registering to vote in the South. Those marches helping led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Over 25,000 supporters of the movement marched for voting rights for African Americans in the South. It was the responsibility of the government to make sure all citizens were equal. The director and writer wanted to prove that the march didn't without some blood being shed. Many protesters died during the multiple attempts to march for the right to vote. This was the organizational method. Martin Luther King believed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Southern Center Leadership Conference, SCLC, was the needed method, while Lyndon Johnson was the actor that acted the president did a very good job. Lyndon Johnson believed that African Americans needed to get used to the Civil Rights Act of 1965. To make the Selma campaign a success, King had to risk everything, including his family, his reputation, and his life in order to come out victoriously over the hate. In this way, the audience is presented with a new, more complete image of King, a prestigious man that isn't without human faults. Martin Luther King believed different, so he made a difference. It is well conceived. The film achieves the director's objectives. The film is pretty straightforward in mentioning King's adultery. DuVernay manages to weave that into his fuel character, so we, as the audience, are able to understand his full person. None of that would have been without the writer and his remarkable interpretation of King. The underlying assumptions are to have voting rights for African Americans during that time. They are stated behind a sense of objectivity. It shows what African Americans were treated as and what they had to do in order to have voting rights. It was to show the reasoning behind President Lyndon Johnson's law signed on August 6, 1965. It outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted in many southern states after the Civil War, including literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting. The assumptions and biases affect the validity of the film by the incident that as soon as it was released, a former aide of LBJ and the director of the LBJ Library and Museum accused the movie of playing down the president's role in the Voting Rights Act, setting off a debate on the internet that could have affected their movie's Oscar chances. The mayor of Selma, George P. Evans, defended the movie by reminding people that it is not a documentary. But to me, even documentaries are subjective, and the most interesting documentaries readily admit to their biases. This movie, just like every other, has its own biases. A documentary. But to me, even documentaries are subjective, and the most interesting documentaries readily admit to their biases. This movie, just like every other, has its own biases. I think two historians could look at the same sets of facts and come out with a different version of world's events, and both of those narratives can have value. In the film Selma, those criticizing the movie have their own interests. The two main Selma critics worked for the LBJ and his estate. LBJ stands for President Lyndon Baines Johnson. It is obvious in their interest to defend his legacy. Fiction movies require suspense of disbelief, even if they are based on someone who really existed. They are made to entertain, to appeal to emotion, and to tell a compelling story, even if that story is not the exact truth. Ava DuVernay acknowledged this when she addressed the controversy surrounding Selma. I truly enjoy watching the movie Selma. I have watched it numerous of times since it has been published. It gave me a better picture of how it was in 1965. The acting was top-notch. To see the faces on the marches during Bloody Sunday was devastating. It's awful to know people went through this. Some conversations could have used some trimming. There are some slow parts, but it is an overall great movie. I agree, Selma is an award-winning film.